All right, everybody, we are back with our latest section for our new criminology course, and this one is all about social disorganization. In other words, crime is a matter of neighborhood or geographic area, right? Now, these social disorganization theories are often referred to as structural theories because they see crime as the problem or as a problem of the structure of the places in which people are living, right? Um, so the first kind of dipping the toe in the water towards generation of these social disorganization theories actually happened in 19th century France. Okay, so if you'll remember from our early sections, the primary kind of thought or the primary factor that most people thought crime was correlated with in this kind of time period was rational choice theory, right? Going back to Beccaria and the whole rational choice deterrence thing, right? Well, these two guys in France, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce their names here, but Quetelet and Guerry, they were the first people to really start collecting statistics and data on where crimes were happening and who was committing it, and what types of crime were happening in different spots and different times and all that stuff. And they noticed a bunch of patterns that were not necessarily compatible with the whole rational choice idea, right? And one of the biggest was that crime isn't necessarily a problem of the poor. Crime wasn't higher in poor areas that were where everybody was poor. Crime was highest in areas where poor and rich were near each other geographically, right? So it was the much wealthier, much more educated areas where there was a vast split in education and wealth, not necessarily the ones where poor areas where there was a much smaller split in education and wealth and such, right? So it was the differences between levels of education and wealth of the people living in the area that determined crime rate, not just the wealth and education of the people living in an area, right? Now, social disorganization really became a thing in the city of Chicago, and for lots of reasons, okay? First off, is the University of Chicago was a really big, heavy research institution, especially in the field of sociology in the early 20th century. But Chicago itself, the city, is also kind of a really interesting natural experiment in crime and sociology and a bunch of other fields, right? For a few different reasons. But it was, it started out relatively small. It was just kind of a small city on one of the Great Lakes. But then with the American westward expansion, especially in the 19th century, Chicago grew really, really, really quickly. And it grew kind of in interesting and easily observable ways. Okay, because there were so many people passing through Chicago on their path to go out west. But then a lot of people just kind of stayed in Chicago, and the city grew and grew and grew and grew. And it became such a huge transport hub and economic hub and all these things. But the history of the United States is really that history of immigration, right? And that immigration wasn't uniform across all of American history. Immigration, and specifically where immigrants are from, kind of came in waves, right? And it's been doing this all throughout American history. It probably will continue to do so long after I'm done recording this video. But there was, it wasn't people coming from all different countries all at once at the same rate. It was very much, there was a German immigrant wave, and then a Irish immigrant wave, then an Italian immigrant wave, then Chinese immigrants, then Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, then, so each time this new group would come in and they would kind of represent that culture as the new immigrants within the United States. It has been a couple of generations since the last major immigrant wave. And every single time, like clockwork, all of the previously arriving immigrant waves, where they're now on their third, fourth, fifth, even higher generation of being descended from that immigrant crime wave, they say, oh, these new immigrants, they're all criminals and they're all, horrible people, and they're not, we're letting in all of the wrong people into our country. And then that immigrant wave kind of settles down, and they have kids, and those kids have kids, and then it's a new immigrant wave comes in, and all of the kind of pointing out that new immigrant wave, oh, they're all criminals and they're ruining our country and we're not letting the right people in here. And it's the exact same pattern over and over and over and over, right? So one of the kind of focuses of this sociology and the University of Chicago was to try to see if that was true. Did these different immigrant waves have different levels of criminality? All that stuff. So the first theorist we're going to talk about is this guy Burgess. And Burgess looked at this history of Chicago and how these different, immigrants would come through, and then many would leave, but many would stay, and more immigrants, and Chicago became such a center point for this westward expansion process. And he looked at the kind of history of how the city grew and developed geographically. And he noticed that there were kind of zones, right? With, the innermost zone being the main downtown commercial area. And as the city grew, each of the zones grew, with one pushing into the geographic areas previously occupied by the next one out, right? So as zone 1 grew, it would push into zone 2. As zone 2 grew, it pushed into zone 3. As zone 3 grew, it pushed into zone 4. But those zones shared this same pattern over kind of the lifetime, and as the city grew, that process and those zones remained in the same pattern, but growing to cover different geographic areas within the city or as the city grows, right? So Burgess had this idea of these zones and noticed how each one is kind of characterized by a different type of occupant, different types of buildings. And while the size of each grows over time, the pattern stays the same, right? So then Shaw and McKay, in the very early 20th century, I want to say the 30s, they specifically applied this idea of these zones to crime, right? So the important zones here for us are 1, 2, and 3, right? So 1 is the central business district, right? This is downtown. This is where we have, all the high rises. This is where we have the factories and commercial areas and all that stuff, right? Zone 3 is kind of the working class people living areas, right? But zone 2, the one that Burgess called the zone in transition, this is the one that we're most interested in. This is the one where crime is almost exclusively happening, okay? So Zone 2, remember, if Zone 1 is central business district and Zone 3 is like working class residential, Zone 2 is the zone in transition between the two, right? So it's got businesses and factories and warehouses and such that are kind of pushing into Zone 2. And then what's kind of leaving Zone 2, if you will, is this working class area. So it's usually the oldest, cheapest houses. Essentially, it's the place where nobody really wants to live because of those two pressures. Zone 3 is leaving, so it's, all these old, cheap, not so great houses. And Zone 1 is pushing in with all its, factories and warehouses and all that kind of stuff. So Zone 2, this zone in transition, is the one where nobody wants to be. And thus, who gets to be there? Recent immigrants, the ones who have the least amount of kind of economic and social ability to be anywhere else, right? They were kind of left there by default. They're the only ones who didn't really have anywhere better to go, right? So Sean McKay noticed that it's this area where these recent immigrants are that has basically all of the social ills. And their idea was this Zone 2 had all these social ills because it didn't have proper social controls. The people who live there hadn't generated the kind of organized neighborhood where people look out for each other and people know each other, that prevents crime from happening, right? So, this Zone 2, it wasn't just crime that Sean McKay found, right? It's poverty. This is where the people who had the worst jobs or no jobs at all were forced to live. Heterogeneity, i.e. lots of kind of different people from different countries, some either first generation immigrants or maybe second generation children, right? Different languages, different religions, different cultures. Lots of physical dilapidation because, again, these are kind of a lot of the oldest buildings in the city, especially the oldest housing areas of the city. Lots of drugs and alcohol. Lots of pollution. Highly mobile residents. People are kind of moving in and then moving out as quickly as they can. Lots of infant mortality, disease. All of these problems were concentrated in Zone 2. But of course, most kind of important for this course is crime. Zone 2 was where a huge chunk of all the crime happened. But importantly, one of the conclusions that Sean McKay found was that crime didn't follow the immigrant group, as that immigrant group kind of, after a few generations, acquired some generational wealth, moved out to the suburbs, moved out to further outside zones, outside of Zone 2. The crime stayed in Zone 2, even as these waves of immigrants came through, occupied Zone 2 for a while, had high rates of crime. But when that immigrant wave gained enough wealth to move away from Zone 2, the crime stayed in Zone 2. It didn't follow the immigrants out, right? So when Italians were the big immigrant wave, they were mostly criminal because they were the ones living in Zone 2. So everybody saw them as criminals because the Italian neighborhoods was where the crime was happening. But then as Italian families kind of were able to become established and move away, it was the next wave of immigrants that were living in Zone 2, and thus everybody pointed to them as the criminals because that's where all the crime was happening in that culture's neighborhood. And this is a process that still continues today, of course, right? The big immigrant wave, kind of as I record this, is Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, things like that. And there are news reports and politicians all the time that say, oh, they're criminals and blah, blah, blah. But the data kind of disagrees with that. But this is a grand American tradition of blaming every new immigrant wave for crime, um, despite the fact that it's not that group that really. It's not that they're any more criminal than anybody else, and literally every immigrant group has been saddled with the exact same label at some point in American history, right? All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. We'll be back with the next subsection in just a moment.